Staff Sergeant Maya Rodriguez had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan and completed every mission assigned to her unit. Her male colleagues whispered she was too soft for real combat operations. On the night of September 23rd, when everyone else had given up hope, Maya would walk into enemy territory alone and bring home 6 captured soldiers that the Pentagon had already declared dead. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete training grounds at Fort Braxton as Maya adjusted her tactical vest for the 4th time that week. Around her, the 75th Ranger Regiment conducted their daily drills with the precision that had made them legendary. But Maya wasn't running the obstacle course with her team. She was standing on the sidelines, clipboard in hand, watching other soldiers prepare for missions she should have been leading. Colonel James Harrison emerged from the command building, his dress uniform pristine despite the dusty conditions. He surveyed the training yard with the calculating gaze of a man who had spent 25 years turning civilians into elite warriors. When his eyes found Maya, his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not quite disapproval, but something close to disappointment. "Rodriguez," he called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "My office now." Maya jogged across the compound, her boots striking the pavement in a rhythm she'd perfected during countless miles of conditioning runs. The other soldiers barely glanced her way anymore. After 6 months of being relegated to administrative duties, she'd become part of the background, invisible in the way that only truly overlooked people could be. Colonel Harrison's office walls were lined with commendations, photographs of successful operations, and a large map of current deployment zones marked with red pins. Maya had studied that map during her previous visits, memorizing the locations where her fellow Rangers were currently engaged in missions she'd been deemed unsuitable for. "Sit down, Rodriguez." Harrison settled behind his desk without looking at her directly. "I've been reviewing your personnel file again." Maya remained standing. "Sir, if this is about the Kandahar operation review, I've already submitted my "It's not about Kandahar." Harrison finally met her eyes. "Your performance in Afghanistan was exemplary. Your marksmanship scores are among the highest in the regiment. Your tactical assessments have been consistently accurate, and your leadership during the evacuation of Forward Operating Base Delta saved 17 lives." Maya felt a spark of hope. "Then why am I still pushing papers instead of because?" Leadership isn't just about individual performance. Harrison leaned back in his chair. It's about commanding respect from your subordinates. It's about projecting the kind of authority that makes enemy combatants think twice before engaging. It's about— He paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. "It's about fitting the profile that our adversaries have learned to fear." The words hit Maya like a physical blow, though she'd heard variations of this speech before. Not from Harrison directly, but from the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room, from the assignments that somehow never included her name, from the way training exercises were restructured whenever she was supposed to participate. "Sir, with respect, my track record speaks for itself. I've completed every mission assigned to me. I've never failed a physical fitness test. My tactical knowledge is excellent," Harrison interrupted. "But Maya, you have to understand the reality of what we do here. When our enemies see a Ranger unit approaching, they need to see something that makes them want to surrender rather than fight. They need to see warriors who look like they could tear them apart with their bare hands." Maya's jaw tightened. "And you don't think I look like that kind of warrior. I think you look like exactly what you are. A highly competent soldier who happens to be ... Boo quotes Harrison gestured vaguely. "Look, Rodriguez, this isn't personal. It's about mission effectiveness. When local militia groups see you, they see someone they might be able to intimidate or manipulate. They see someone who might hesitate at a crucial moment because of misplaced empathy." "Misplaced empathy?" Maya's voice remained level, but Harrison caught the dangerous edge creeping into her tone. You know what I mean. During the Helmand Province operation, you spent 40 minutes trying to negotiate with those insurgents instead of neutralizing the threat immediately. Your after-action report talked about understanding their motivations and seeking nonviolent solutions. That approach led to the surrender of 12 enemy combatants without a single casualty on either side, Maya reminded him. Intelligence gathered from those prisoners prevented 3 separate attacks on coalition forces. Yes, it worked out that time. But what happens when negotiation isn't an option? What happens when the mission requires someone who can make the hard choices without second-guessing themselves? Harrison picked up a folder from his desk. I'm reassigning you to the Intelligence Analysis Division. Your skills would be better utilized there. Maya stared at the folder as if it contained a death sentence. Intelligence analysis meant a desk job. It meant reviewing reports written by the soldiers who were actually in the field, making recommendations for operations she'd never be allowed to participate in. It meant the end of everything she'd worked toward since enlisting 8 years ago. Colonel, I've dedicated my entire adult life to becoming the best ranger I could be. I've sacrificed relationships, opportunities, everything, to prove I belong. In this unit, you can't just, I can and I am. Harrison's voice carried the finality of military authority. The decision is effective immediately. Report to Major Stevens in Building C tomorrow morning. Maya felt the familiar burn of injustice in her chest, the same feeling she'd experienced during every conversation like this throughout her career. The assumption that her gender made her inherently less capable, less intimidating, less worthy of the respect her male colleagues took for granted. She'd heard it all before, too emotional, too hesitant, too concerned with minimizing casualties, too feminine for the brutal realities of special operations. Permission to speak freely, sir. Harrison nodded curtly. This decision isn't based on my performance or my capabilities. It's based on your assumption that I don't fit the image of what a ranger should look like. You're punishing me for succeeding in ways that don't match your preconceptions about how success should appear. Rodriguez, I'm not finished, sir. Maya's voice remained respectful but unwavering. You mentioned the Helmand Province operation. What you didn't mention was that my empathy led to intelligence that saved the lives of an entire platoon. You didn't mention that my hesitation prevented a massacre that would have turned the local population against our mission. You didn't mention that my approach achieved every objective with 0 friendly casualties. Harrison's expression hardened. Your methods may have worked in Afghanistan, but this is a different kind of warfare. The missions we're facing now require a different approach. What missions? Maya asked. I haven't been briefed on any new operations. That's because you're not cleared for that information anymore. Harrison stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. Report to Major Stevens tomorrow. That's an order. Maya saluted and turned to leave, but Harrison's voice stopped her at the door. Rodriguez, for what it's worth, you're a good soldier. You just aren't the right soldier for what we need right now. As Maya walked back across the training yard, she noticed how the other rangers looked at her. Some with pity, others with relief that they wouldn't have to serve alongside someone who might compromise their unit's reputation. A few younger soldiers watched with something that might have been admiration, but they quickly looked away when the senior staff noticed that Maya had always known this moment might come. Despite her achievements, despite proving herself in combat, situations that had broken other soldiers, she'd never truly been accepted as one of them. Her success was always qualified, always explained away as luck or exceptional circumstances rather than skill and dedication. She thought about her father, who had served 3 tours in Vietnam and taught her that military service was about more than personal advancement. It was about protecting the people who couldn't protect themselves, about standing between innocent civilians and those who would harm them. He'd never told her that her gender would be seen as a disqualification for that service, But as Maya walked toward an uncertain future, she had no idea that within 72 hours, everything would change. A crisis was approaching that would test every assumption her superiors had made about strength, courage, and what it truly meant to be a warrior. Maya spent her first morning in the Intelligence Analysis Division, staring at satellite images of terrain she'd never be allowed to set foot on again. Major Stevens had assigned her a cubicle in the back corner of the building, far from the windows where she might catch glimpses of actual Rangers preparing for real missions. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in the same sterile glow that made coffee taste like metal and hope feel like a luxury she couldn't afford. "Rodriguez, I need those threat assessments on my desk by 1400 hours. Stevens called out from his office. He was a career intelligence officer who'd never deployed beyond the safety of command centers, but he spoke to Maya with the casual authority of someone who believed desk work was the natural ceiling for her ambitions. Out at her old station in the Field Operations Center, Maya would have been analyzing real-time intelligence that could mean the difference between life and death for Rangers in combat. Here, she was reviewing week-old reports about supply chain disruptions and updating databases that no one would ever reference. It was the kind of work designed to make soldiers forget they'd ever wanted to be warriors. The other analysts treated her with polite indifference. They knew her reputation, knew she'd been demoted from active duty, but none of them seemed particularly interested in understanding why. To them, she was just another washout who'd failed to meet the standards of elite operations. The fact that she'd never actually failed anything didn't seem relevant to their assessment. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Brennan entered the Intelligence Center just after noon, her presence immediately commanding attention from everyone in the room. Brennan was one of the few female officers who'd achieved senior rank in special operations, but her path had been through logistics and strategic planning rather than direct combat roles. She'd built her career by being indispensable rather than irreplaceable, and her success came with an unspoken understanding that she wouldn't challenge the fundamental assumptions about who belonged in the field. "Stevens, I need to review the personnel files for Operation Nightfall," Brennan announced, her voice carrying across the cubicles. "Authorization came down from command this morning." Maya looked up from her computer screen. Operation Nightfall wasn't in any of the databases she had access to, but the name sent a chill through the room. The other analysts exchanged glances that suggested they knew something she didn't, something that made them uncomfortable. Stevens emerged from his office with a thick folder marked with security classifications Maya hadn't seen since her deployment days. "Ma'am, the files are ready for your review. Should I prepare the briefing room?" "No need. I'll review them here." Brennan settled at an empty desk near Maya's cubicle, close enough that Maya could see the personnel photographs clipped to the inside of the folder. 6 Rangers, all male, all members of the unit's most elite strike team. As Brennan reviewed the files, Maya caught fragments of the assessment criteria: physical fitness scores, psychological evaluations, combat experience ratings, and something called mission survivability projections that seemed to carry more weight than any other factor. "Stevens, what's the current status on the Pakistani border situation?" Brennan asked without looking up from the files. "Intelligence suggests the situation is deteriorating faster than anticipated," Stevens replied. "The terrorist cell that took our people has moved them to a compound approximately 40 kilometers inside the border. Pakistani authorities are denying knowledge of the operation, and our diplomatic channels have been unsuccessful." Maya's attention sharpened. Captured personnel meant American soldiers were being held by enemy forces, and the discussion suggested rescue operations were being planned. This was exactly the kind of mission she'd trained for, exactly the kind of situation where her skills would be most valuable. "What about extraction options?" Brennan continued. "Limited. The compound is heavily fortified, surrounded by hostile territory, and located in a region where Pakistani military patrols are frequent. Any rescue operation would have to be fast, quiet, and executed by personnel capable of operating independently for extended periods. Brennan nodded grimly. And our timeline? Intelligence suggests we have perhaps 72 hours before the captured personnel are moved to a location where rescue becomes impossible. After that ... Stevens didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Maya tried to focus on her assigned work, but she couldn't ignore the conversation happening a few feet away. 6 captured Rangers meant 6 families waiting for news, 6 soldiers depending on their brothers to bring them home. It meant a mission that would test every skill the regiment had developed, every tactical innovation made refined through years of combat experience. "Ma'am, about the team selection," Stevens said quietly. "Command has some concerns about the psychological profiles." "What kind of concerns?" "The target demographic for this operation includes civilian populations that might be more effectively managed through—" Stevens paused, choosing his words carefully. "Through approaches that prioritize negotiation over immediate force." Brennan's expression darkened. "Stevens, this isn't a peacekeeping mission. We're talking about extracting captured personnel from a heavily defended position under extreme time constraints. Negotiation isn't an option." "Understood, ma'am." "But the intelligence reports suggest that civilian casualties could complicate the mission significantly. Local population sympathy could determine whether our extraction team faces pursuit or finds assistance." Maya remembered similar conversations from her deployment in Afghanistan. The assumption that avoiding civilian casualties was somehow incompatible with mission success, that caring about collateral damage made soldiers weak or ineffective. She'd proven that assumption wrong multiple times, but the prejudice persisted. "The team has been selected based on combat effectiveness," Brennan said firmly. "Personal considerations are secondary to mission requirements." "Of course, ma'am. It's just that some of the personnel files show patterns of engagement that might not be optimal for this particular scenario." Maya glanced at the files on Brennan's desk. She couldn't read the details, but she could see the photographs of the selected Rangers. She recognized most of them, exceptional soldiers with impressive combat records, but all of them known for their preference for overwhelming force over subtle tactics. Sergeant Miller, whose approach to crowd control had resulted in 3 separate incidents requiring diplomatic intervention. Staff Sergeant Thompson, whose interrogation techniques had been the subject of multiple reviews. Lieutenant Morrison, whose tactical decisions consistently prioritized speed over precision, leading to higher casualty rates than necessary. They were all capable soldiers, but Maya knew their methods. When faced with complex situations involving civilian populations, they defaulted to intimidation and force. In a rescue operation where local cooperation could mean the difference between success and disaster, their approach might create more problems than it solved. "Stevens, I want those team assignments finalized by 1600 hours, Brennan said, closing the folder. "And I want a full briefing packet prepared for Colonel Harrison's review." As Brennan left the intelligence center, Maya found herself staring at her computer screen without seeing the data displayed there. 6 Rangers were depending on a rescue operation that would be carried out by soldiers whose tactical philosophy might sabotage their own mission. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd been removed from active duty because her superiors believed her approach was too cautious, too concerned with minimizing casualties, too focused on building rather than burning bridges. Now, those same superiors were planning a mission where bridge building might be the key to success, and they were assigning it to soldiers who specialized in demolition. Maya tried to return to her assigned work, but the weight of knowledge made concentration impossible. Somewhere across the Pakistani border, 6 American soldiers were waiting for rescue. Their lives depended on a mission that might fail not because of enemy action, But because of the same institutional blindness that had relegated Maya to a cubicle in the intelligence center, the afternoon stretched on with the painful slowness of watching disaster approach from a distance. Maya completed her assignments mechanically, filed her reports, and attended the mandatory briefings that filled her schedule with the illusion of purpose. But her mind remained focused on those 6 personnel files and the growing certainty that the wrong team was being sent on the right mission. That evening, Maya found herself in the base gymnasium long after the official training hours had ended. The weight room was empty except for the steady hum of ventilation systems and the distant sound of night operations continuing across the compound. She'd been coming here every night since her reassignment, using physical exhaustion as a way to quiet the frustration that had become her constant companion. The barbell felt familiar in her hands as she positioned herself for another set of deadlifts. 220 pounds, the same weight she'd been lifting since her deployment days, when staying strong wasn't just about personal fitness but about survival. Each repetition was a reminder that her body hadn't forgotten what it was trained for, even if her superiors had decided to forget what she was capable of. Maya had always been methodical in her approach to training. While other soldiers focused on building mass or improving their bench press numbers, she concentrated on functional strength that would serve her in combat situations. Her workout routine included exercises designed to simulate the physical demands of carrying wounded soldiers, climbing over obstacles while wearing full gear, and maintaining accuracy with weapon systems after hours of physical exertion. Between sets, she practiced the mental exercises her father had taught her during childhood, visualization techniques that helped her maintain focus under pressure, breathing patterns that could slow her heart rate during high-stress situations, and the kind of tactical thinking that turned complex problems into manageable sequences of decisions. These weren't skills that appeared on any official training manual, but they'd kept her alive during 3 deployments and helped her succeed in situations where other soldiers had failed. The gym's mirrors reflected a woman who looked nothing like the stereotypical image of a special forces operator, but Maya had long since stopped caring about appearances. At 5 feet 6 inches and 140 pounds, she wasn't the most intimidating physical presence in the Rangers. But she could run farther, shoot more accurately, and think more clearly under pressure than most of the soldiers who'd been deemed more suitable for elite operations. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her sister Carmen, a nurse in San Antonio who'd been following Maya's career with the proud concern that only family members could maintain. "How's the new assignment going? Dad keeps asking if you're okay." Maya stared at the message for several minutes before responding. "Everything's fine. Tell Dad not to worry." It was a lie, but the truth was too complicated to explain in a text message. How could she tell her family that years of dedication and sacrifice had led to a cubicle in an intelligence center? How could she explain that her commitment to minimizing casualties and building relationships with local populations had been interpreted as weakness rather than wisdom? As she moved to the pull-up bar, Maya's mind wandered to the Rangers currently preparing for Operation Nightfall. She'd seen them in the corridors throughout the day, recognizing the focused intensity that preceded high-stakes missions. Their confidence was evident in their posture, their conversations, their casual assumption that success was inevitable because they'd been selected for the task. Maya remembered that feeling from her own deployment days. The certainty that came with knowing your team trusted your abilities, that your superiors believed in your judgment, that you were exactly where you belonged. She'd thrived on the responsibility of making life-and-death decisions, of leading soldiers through situations where hesitation meant disaster and aggression could create even worse problems. During her second tour in Afghanistan, Maya had developed what she privately called her grandfather's approach to combat situations. Her paternal grandfather had been a World War II veteran who'd served in the Pacific Theater, And he'd taught her that the most effective warriors weren't necessarily the most violent ones. They were the ones who understood that every enemy combatant was someone's son, someone's father, someone who'd made choices based on circumstances she might never fully understand. That perspective had made her more effective, not less. When she approached enemy positions with the assumption that surrender was preferable to death, insurgents were more likely to lay down their weapons. When she treated captured prisoners with dignity rather than contempt, they were more likely to provide accurate intelligence. When she worked with local populations as allies rather than obstacles, missions succeeded with fewer casualties and better long-term outcomes. But those successes had been interpreted as luck rather than skill, as exceptional circumstances rather than replicable methods. Her superiors praised her results while questioning her techniques, commending her achievements while expressing doubts about her approach. The message was clear: she could succeed, but only in spite of her methods, not because of them. Maya finished her workout and headed to the showers, passing through corridors lined with photographs of successful ranger operations. Her own image appeared in several of them, usually positioned at the edge of group photos or identified in captions that mentioned her role without emphasizing her contributions. She'd learned to recognize this pattern of selective visibility, where her presence was acknowledged but her importance was minimized out in her quarters. Maya opened the footlocker that contained her personal belongings from deployment. Beneath folded uniforms and equipment manuals, she found the journal she'd kept during her tours in Afghanistan. The pages contained detailed observations about tactical situations, cultural insights that had proven valuable during operations, and personal reflections about the psychological demands of combat service. One entry, written after a particularly difficult mission in Kandahar province, captured her philosophy about military service. Strength isn't about how much force you can apply. It's about knowing exactly how much force is necessary and having the discipline to use no more than that. The strongest warriors are the ones who can choose peace when war is possible, who can show mercy when vengeance is easier, who can build trust when fear is simpler. Those words had been written after an operation where her decision to negotiate with insurgents had prevented a firefight that could have killed dozens of civilians. The intelligence gathered from that negotiation had led to the disruption of 3 separate terrorist cells and saved countless lives. But her after-action report had been filed away without comment, while other operations that achieved less strategic value but involved more dramatic combat received extensive recognition. Maya closed the journal and prepared for another night of restless sleep. Tomorrow would bring another day of database updates and report analysis, another day of watching real operations from a distance, while knowing she could contribute more than the soldiers actually assigned to carry them out. The frustration was becoming a physical weight in her chest, a constant reminder that her expertise was being wasted while American soldiers faced dangers she was uniquely qualified to help them navigate. But as Maya settled into her narrow military cot, she had no way of knowing that in 18 hours, everything would change. The carefully planned Operation Nightfall would encounter complications that no amount of force could overcome, and the institutional assumptions that had sidelined her would prove catastrophically wrong. The mission would require exactly the kind of tactical thinking her superiors had dismissed as incompatible with special operations success. The captured rangers would need someone who understood that true strength sometimes looked like weakness, that the most effective approach wasn't always the most aggressive one, and that winning sometimes meant being willing to risk everything for soldiers who'd never doubted they were worth saving. The first indication that something was wrong came at 0630 hours, when Maya noticed unusual activity around the FUN Communications Center. Instead of the routine morning briefings that typically marked the start of each day, clusters of senior officers were moving between buildings with the kind of urgent purpose that suggested developing crisis situations. Maya recognized the pattern from her deployment days. the subtle shift in bass rhythm that occurred when operations began encountering unexpected complications. Major, Stevens arrived at the intelligence center 30 minutes earlier than usual. His normally pressed uniform showing signs of having been hastily assembled. He moved directly to his office without acknowledging the analysts already at their stations. But Maya could see him through the glass partition, making phone calls that required him to reference classified documents he kept pulling from his safe. "Rodriguez, I need you to pull all available intelligence on the Waziristan border region," Stevens called out, his voice carrying an edge Maya hadn't heard before. "Focus on anything related to tribal leadership structures, local militia capabilities, and recent changes in territorial control." Maya's pulse quickened. Waziristan was the region where Operation Nightfall was supposed to be taking place, and Stevens' request suggested the mission was encountering complications that required additional intelligence support. She accessed the databases and began compiling the requested information, but her years of experience told her that last-minute intelligence requests usually meant operations were not proceeding according to plan. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan entered the center at 0745 hours, her typically composed demeanor showing cracks that Maya had never seen before. She carried a secure communication device that had been buzzing constantly since her arrival, and each call seemed to deepen the concern evident in her expression. "Stevens, what's the status on those tribal analysis reports?" Brennan demanded. "Rodriguez is compiling now, ma'am. Should be ready within the hour." "We don't have an hour." Brennan's voice carried the strain of someone dealing with rapidly evolving crisis situations. The insertion team encountered unexpected resistance during their approach to the target compound. Local militia groups that weren't supposed to be in the area have surrounded their position. Maya's hands paused over her keyboard. Unexpected resistance meant the pre-mission intelligence had been incomplete or inaccurate, and local militia involvement suggested the operation was facing complications that could compromise both the rescue mission and the safety of the rescue. "Team, ma'am, what about extraction options for the insertion team?" Stevens asked. "Limited. The militia groups have established checkpoints on all the major routes leading away from the target area. Our people are effectively trapped between the compound they're trying to reach and hostile forces that have them surrounded." Maya pulled up detailed maps of the Waziristan region, overlaying them with intelligence reports about tribal territories and militia operating areas. The picture that emerged was troubling. The insertion team had entered a region where 3 different tribal groups maintained uneasy territorial boundaries, and their presence had apparently triggered a response that brought all 3 groups into cooperation against the perceived American intrusion. "Stevens, I need you to contact command and request permission to abort the mission," Brennan said. "The risk to the insertion team is becoming unacceptable." "Ma'am, what about the captured personnel? If we abort now?" "I know what it means." Brennan's voice carried the weight of someone making impossible decisions. "But I can't justify risking 12 more lives for 6 soldiers who may already be beyond help." Maya looked up from her computer screen. "Ma'am, permission to speak?" Brennan glanced at her with surprise, as if she'd forgotten Maya was present. "What is it, Rodriguez?" "The tribal dynamics in this region follow predictable patterns based on historical precedent. The militia response isn't random. It's following established protocols for defending territorial boundaries against foreign intrusion." "Get to the point, Rodriguez. If the insertion team is trapped between the compound and hostile militia, their best option might be to approach the situation as a diplomatic challenge rather than a military one. The tribal leaders in this region have established codes of conduct for negotiating passage through disputed territories." Stevens looked at Maya as if she'd suggested something absurd. "Rodriguez, this is a combat operation, not a cultural exchange program. The insertion team is trained for direct action, not diplomatic negotiations." "With respect, sir," Their direct action training is what got them trapped. The militia response was predictable if anyone had considered the cultural context of their approach. Brennan studied Maya with renewed attention. "Explain." Maya pulled up the tribal territory maps on her computer and turned the screen so Brennan could see it. The insertion team's approach route took them through territory claimed by the Mesed tribe, but their extraction route was planned through an area controlled by the Wazir tribe. Both groups maintained traditional hospitality obligations, but only if approached according to established protocols. "What kind of protocols?" Brennan asked. "Requests for safe passage have to be made through recognized intermediaries, with appropriate acknowledgement of territorial sovereignty and compensation for any inconvenience caused by the passage. The tribes have been using these systems for centuries to manage competing claims over the same territories." Stevens shook his head. "Rodriguez, we can't expect Special Forces operators to conduct diplomatic negotiations in the middle of a rescue mission. They're not trained for that kind of work." "They're not," Maya agreed. "But someone who understood the protocols could potentially negotiate safe passage for both the insertion team and the captured personnel." Brennan was quiet for several moments, studying the maps and intelligence reports Maya had compiled. "Rodriguez, are you suggesting that we should attempt to negotiate with the militia groups that have our insertion team surrounded?" "I'm suggesting that the military approach has reached its limitations. The insertion team is trapped because they approach the situation as a combat problem when it should have been treated as a cultural navigation challenge. And you believe you understand these cultural protocols well enough to make such negotiations successful?" Maya met Brennan's gaze directly. "I've spent 3 years studying the tribal structures in this region. I've conducted successful negotiations with similar groups in Afghanistan. And I understand that sometimes the best way to demonstrate strength is to show respect for local customs rather than trying to overwhelm them with force." The communication device on Brennan's belt buzzed again. She answered it with visible reluctance. "Brennan here. Yes, sir, I understand." "No, sir, the situation has not improved." "Yes, sir, I'll prepare the abort authorization." As Brennan ended the call, Maya realized that in a few hours, 6 captured Rangers would be abandoned to their fate because the rescue operation had been planned by people who understood weapons and tactics but had never learned that some problems couldn't be solved by force alone. The irony was almost overwhelming. She'd been removed from active duty because her superiors believed her approach was too soft for elite operations. And now their aggressive approach was failing, precisely because it lacked the diplomatic sophistication she could have provided. The call came at 11:47 hours, crackling through the secure communication system with the urgency that marked operational disasters. Maya heard Brennan's voice change as she answered, transitioning from controlled concern to barely contained alarm in the space of a single conversation. "Understood. How many casualties?" "Jesus Christ." "No, sir. Negative on extraction possibilities." "Yes, sir. I'll prepare the family's notification." Maya's stomach dropped as she processed the fragments of conversation she could hear. Casualties meant the situation had escalated beyond containment, and family notifications meant American soldiers were dead or missing. The rescue operation that was supposed to bring 6 Rangers home had instead created a larger crisis that threatened even more lives. Brennan ended the call and stood motionless for several seconds, staring at the communication device as if it might offer different information upon reflection. When she finally looked up, her expression carried the haunted quality that Maya recognized from commanders who'd been forced to make impossible choices with insufficient information. "Stevens, I need you to contact the casualty notification officers." "Immediately," Brennan said. "We have 3 Kier from the insertion team and 2 more missing in action. The remaining team members are pinned down approximately 2 kilometers from the target compound with no viable extraction route." Maya felt The familiar cold sensation that accompanied news of fallen soldiers. 3 dead Rangers meant 3 families whose lives had just been shattered. 3 soldiers who trusted their leadership to bring them home safely. The missing personnel brought the total number of captured Americans to 8, assuming they were still alive. "Ma'am, what's the status of the original rescue target?" Stevens asked. "Unknown. The insertion team never reached the compound where our people are being held. They're currently trapped in a defensive position with limited ammunition and no way to complete their mission or retreat to safety." Maya pulled up real-time satellite imagery of the region, watching as the tactical situation deteriorated in ways that confirmed her earlier assessment. The militia groups that had surrounded the insertion team weren't conducting random attacks. They were implementing a coordinated strategy designed to force the Americans into an untenable position, where surrender would be their only option. The militia forces have established a perimeter that's gradually contracting, Maya observed, studying the satellite feeds. They're not trying to overrun our position immediately. They're applying pressure that will force our people to exhaust their ammunition and supplies before attempting a final assault. Brennan moved to look over Maya's shoulder at the screen. "How long do you estimate before our people are forced to surrender?" "Based on standard ammunition loads and the current rate of engagement, maybe 6 hours. Less if the militia forces decide to accelerate their timeline." The secure phone rang again, and Brennan answered with visible reluctance. Maya could hear Colonel Harrison's voice through the speaker, demanding status updates that Brennan couldn't provide in extraction. Options that didn't exist. "Sir, the situation has exceeded our operational parameters," Brennan reported. "We're looking at the potential loss of an entire insertion team in addition to the original captured personnel. No, sir, we don't have assets in position for immediate extraction. The nearest support is 18 hours away, and the tactical situation will be resolved long before then." Maya watched the satellite imagery update in real time, showing heat signatures that represented American soldiers fighting for their lives in terrain that offered minimal cover against an enemy that understood the local geography better than any intelligence briefing could convey. The insertion team was trapped in exactly the kind of situation their training had prepared them for, but their preparation had been based on assumptions about enemy capabilities that were proving catastrophically incorrect. "Harrison's ordering a complete mission abort," Brennan announced after ending the call. "All remaining assets are to be pulled back to secure positions, and we're to begin casualty notification procedures for the insertion team." "Ma'am, that means abandoning 11 American soldiers," Stevens pointed out. "I'm aware of what it means." Brennan's voice carried the bitter edge of someone forced to accept unacceptable outcomes. "But Command won't authorize additional assets for what they're calling an unrecoverable situation." Maya stared at the screen showing the positions of soldiers who would be dead within hours unless someone found a way to change the tactical equation. Everything she'd learned about military service, about the commitment to leave no soldier behind, about the obligation to exhaust every possible option before accepting defeat, demanded that she speak up. "Ma'am, there might be another option," Maya said quietly. Brennan looked at her with the expression of someone who'd run out of hope but was willing to listen to anything that might change the outcome. "What kind of option?" "A single operator, approaching the situation through diplomatic channels rather than military ones. Someone who could negotiate safe passage for both groups of captured personnel using the tribal protocols I mentioned earlier." "Rodriguez. We just lost 3 Rangers attempting a direct assault with full team support. You're suggesting that a single operator could succeed where an entire insertion team failed?" "I'm suggesting that the insertion team failed because they approached the situation as a military problem when it's actually a cultural navigation challenge. The militia groups aren't trying to kill Americans. They're trying to defend what they see as territorial sovereignty." Those are completely different motivations that require completely different responses. Stevens shook his head. Even if that analysis is correct, we can't authorize a solo mission into hostile territory. The risk assessment alone would prevent approval from command. What's the current risk assessment for doing nothing? Maya asked. 11 dead Americans and a complete mission failure that will be studied as an example of tactical incompetence for the next 20 years? Brennan was quiet for several moments, studying the satellite imagery and the intelligence reports Maya had compiled. Rodriguez, even if I believed your approach could work, I don't have authorization to deploy personnel for unauthorized rescue operations. Colonel Harrison has already ordered a complete stand-down. Then don't deploy me, Maya said. I'm already assigned to intelligence analysis. Send me to gather additional information about tribal negotiation protocols. What I choose to do with that information while conducting my research is outside the scope of official operations. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, dangerous and impossible to ignore. Maya was proposing to undertake an unauthorized rescue mission that would either save 11 American soldiers or result in her own death in a region where official support would be impossible. Brennan stared at Maya with an expression that combined admiration, concern, and the desperate calculation of someone weighing impossible alternatives against unacceptable outcomes. The silence in the intelligence center stretched for nearly a full minute as Brennan processed Maya's proposal. Through the window, Maya could see the normal rhythm of base operations continuing, as if 11 American soldiers were counting down their final hours in hostile territory. The contrast between routine and crisis felt surreal, like watching the world continue spinning while standing at the edge of a precipice. Rodriguez, what you're suggesting isn't intelligence gathering, Brennan finally said. It's a suicide mission disguised as research. Maya had expected this response, but hearing it spoken aloud forced her to confront the full magnitude of what she was proposing. A solo infiltration into territory controlled by hostile militia groups, with no backup, no extraction plan, and no official authorization. If she succeeded, she might save 11 lives. If she failed, she would simply become the 12th American casualty in an operation that had already exceeded all acceptable loss parameters. Ma'am, with respect, staying here and watching satellite feeds while those soldiers die is also a form of suicide, Maya replied. It's just a slower, safer version that doesn't require anyone to take responsibility for the outcome. Stevens looked between Maya and Brennan with the expression of someone watching a conversation spiral beyond the boundaries of military protocol. Ladies, we need to consider the broader implications here. If Rodriguez is captured or killed during an unauthorized operation, the political ramifications could be catastrophic. The political ramifications of abandoning 11 soldiers are already catastrophic, Maya pointed out. The difference is whether we accept those ramifications as inevitable or try to prevent them. Brennan walked to the window and stared out at the training grounds where Rangers continued their daily drills, unaware that their colleagues were fighting for survival in a situation their leadership had deemed unrecoverable. Maya could see the internal struggle playing out in Brennan's posture, the tension between military discipline and the fundamental obligation to protect soldiers under her command. Rodriguez, even if I were willing to consider this approach, the logistics are impossible, Brennan said without turning around. You can't just walk into tribal territory and expect to negotiate for prisoner releases. These groups don't trust Americans, and they have no reason to believe anything you might offer them. Actually, they do have reasons to trust, Maya said, pulling up her research on tribal negotiation protocols. The Mesed and Wazir tribes have been conducting prisoner exchanges with foreign forces for over 2 centuries. They have established procedures for these situations, but those procedures require specific approaches that demonstrate respect for their authority and understanding of their customs. Maya turned her computer screen so Brennan could see the historical precedents she'd compiled. During the British colonial period, successful prisoner negotiations always involved single emissaries who approached tribal leaders as equals rather than conquerors. The emissaries who succeeded were the ones who acknowledged tribal sovereignty over their territories and offered appropriate compensation for any inconvenience caused by foreign presence. What kind of compensation? Stevens asked. Usually symbolic rather than material. Public acknowledgement of tribal authority, promises of future consultation before conducting operations in their territory, and guarantees that any rescued personnel would leave the region immediately without attempting retaliation. Brennan finally turned away from the window. Rodriguez, you're talking about conducting diplomatic negotiations with terrorist organizations. Even if such negotiations were successful, the precedent could encourage similar groups to capture American personnel specifically to force these kinds of concessions. Ma'am, these aren't terrorist organizations in the traditional sense. They're tribal militias defending what they consider to be ancestral territory against foreign intrusion. Their motivation is territorial sovereignty, not ideological warfare. That distinction creates different negotiation possibilities. Maya could see doubt beginning to compete with desperation in Brennan's expression. The lieutenant colonel was caught between the institutional pressure to follow orders and the personal recognition that following those orders meant accepting the deaths of soldiers she was responsible for protecting. Even if your analysis is correct, I can't authorize an operation that violates direct orders from Colonel Harrison, Brennan said. The consequences for both of us would be career-ending. At minimum, the consequences of doing nothing are life-ending for 11 soldiers, Maya replied. Ma'am, I've spent my entire career being told that my approach to military operations is too soft, too concerned with cultural sensitivities, too focused on building relationships instead of achieving tactical objectives. But right now, those supposedly weak characteristics might be the only thing that can save American lives. The secure communication device buzzed again, and Brennan answered with visible reluctance. Maya could hear Colonel Harrison's voice demanding updates on casualty notification procedures and abort authorization timelines. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but Maya could see each word adding weight to Brennan's already overwhelming burden of responsibility. Harrison wants final confirmation that all assets have been withdrawn to secure positions, Brennan announced after ending the call. He's preparing to brief Pentagon leadership on the mission failure within the next 3 hours. Maya felt time compressing around her like a physical force. Once Harrison briefed the Pentagon, the situation would become locked in bureaucratic concrete. No unauthorized operations would be possible, no creative solutions would be considered, and 11 soldiers would die because their rescue required thinking outside the parameters their leadership was willing to consider. Ma'am, I need to ask you a direct question, Maya said. If you knew with absolute certainty that I could save those 11 soldiers, but doing so would end both of our careers, would you authorize the mission? Brennan stared at Maya for several seconds before responding. That's not a fair question. Rodriguez, I can't know with absolute certainty that any approach will succeed. But you can know with absolute certainty that our current approach will fail. The insertion team is going to be overrun within 6 hours, and the original prisoners will remain in enemy hands indefinitely. Those are guaranteed outcomes, based on the tactical situation as it exists right now. Stevens cleared his throat nervously. Ma'am, perhaps we should consider contacting the International Committee of the Red Cross. They have experience with prisoner negotiations in this region. The ICRC operates through established governmental channels, Maya replied. Any official negotiations would take weeks to arrange, assuming Pakistani authorities would even acknowledge the situation. Our people don't have weeks. Maya pulled up the satellite imagery showing the current positions of the trapped insertion team. The heat signatures were clustered in a defensive formation that wouldn't hold much longer, against the coordinated pressure being applied by surrounding militia forces. Each minute of indecision brought those soldiers closer to a death that could be prevented if someone was willing to risk everything to try a different approach. "Ma'am, I'm not asking for official authorization," Maya said quietly. "I'm asking you to look the other way while I gather intelligence on tribal negotiation protocols. What happens after I gather that intelligence is my decision and my responsibility." Brennan closed her eyes for several seconds, and Maya could see her weighing 11 lives against career survival, moral obligation against military discipline, the certainty of failure against the possibility of court-martial. When Brennan opened her eyes, they held the resolve of someone who had made an impossible choice. "Rodriguez, you have 4 hours to gather intelligence on tribal negotiation protocols in the field," Brennan said, her voice carrying the carefully measured tone of someone providing plausible deniability. "Your research will require you to travel to the Pakistani border region to conduct interviews with local contacts who have experience with prisoner exchange procedures." Maya felt her heart rate spike as she realized Brennan was giving her exactly what she'd asked for: official cover for an unofficial mission. The lieutenant colonel was risking her own career to provide Maya with the minimal authorization needed to attempt what everyone else had deemed impossible. "Ma'am, I'll need access to certain equipment for conducting field research," Maya said, matching Brennan's careful tone. "Stevens, prepare a standard intelligence gathering kit for Rodriguez. Include communication equipment, cultural reference materials, and whatever else she needs for extended field research." Brennan paused meaningfully. "Make sure she has everything necessary to protect herself during her research activities." Stevens looked between them with the expression of someone who understood exactly what was happening, but preferred to maintain plausible ignorance. "Yes, ma'am. I'll have the kit ready within 30 minutes. Maya moved quickly to her computer and began downloading every piece of intelligence she could access about the tribal territories, militia group leadership structures, and prisoner exchange precedents. She burned the information onto multiple storage devices and printed hard copies of the most critical documents. Knowing that electronic communication might be impossible once she entered the field. As she worked, Maya's mind raced through the tactical challenges she would face. Getting to the tribal territories would require crossing approximately 40 kilometers of disputed territory, where Pakistani military patrols, tribal militias, and various insurgent groups maintained overlapping claims of control. Once there, she would need to identify the correct tribal leaders, approach them according to protocols that could mean the difference between negotiation and immediate execution, and convince them to release prisoners they had every strategic reason to keep. "Rodriguez, I need you to understand something," Brennan said quietly, moving close enough that Stevens couldn't overhear. "If this goes wrong, I can't protect you. Officially, you're conducting unauthorized intelligence gathering outside your assigned parameters. If you're captured or killed, the military will disavow any knowledge of your activities." "I understand, ma'am." Maya met Brennan's eyes directly. "But if I don't try, 11 soldiers die, and we all have to live with knowing we had an option. We were too afraid to attempt." Brennan nodded slowly. "What do you need from me?" "Time. Don't report my absence until absolutely necessary. If anyone asks, I'm conducting extended field research that requires radio silence to avoid compromising local contacts." "How long?" Maya checked her watch. The trapped insertion team had perhaps 5 hours before their position became untenable. But she would need at least 2 hours to reach the tribal territories and locate the appropriate leaders. That left a 3-hour window for negotiations that could determine whether 11 Americans lived or died. "Give me 12 hours before reporting me missing," Maya said. "If I haven't made contact by then, assume the mission failed and proceed with casualty notifications." Stevens approached with a tactical bag containing the equipment Maya had requested, along with standard communication gear and reference materials. She noticed he'd included items that weren't typically part of intelligence gathering kits: emergency medical supplies, additional ammunition for her sidearm, and survival equipment designed for extended operations in hostile territory. "The equipment manifest shows standard research materials only," Stevens said meaningfully. "I have no knowledge of any additional items that might have been included by mistake." Maya understood. Stevens was providing her with combat equipment, while maintaining official ignorance about her actual intentions. Like Brennan, he was risking his career to support a mission that violated direct orders but might save American lives. As Maya prepared to leave, she realized this might be the last time she stood in this room, spoke to these colleagues, or wore the uniform that had defined her identity for 8 years. If her mission failed, she would likely die in Pakistani tribal territory with no official acknowledgement of her sacrifice. If it succeeded, but was discovered, she would face court-martial and the end of her military career. Either way, the woman leaving this room was different from the one who had entered it that morning. "Ma'am, there's something else," Maya said. "If this mission succeeds, it's going to raise questions about why conventional approaches failed. The institutional assumptions that led to this crisis need to be examined." Brennan's expression hardened. "Rodriguez, focus on bringing our people home. Let me worry about institutional reform." Maya nodded and shouldered her equipment bag. The weight felt familiar, reminding her of deployments when every mission could be her last, but every success meant soldiers lived to see their families again. She'd forgotten how much she'd missed that sense of purpose, that knowledge that her skills and dedication could make the difference between life and death for people who depended on her. As she walked toward the exit, Maya heard Brennan's voice behind her. "Rodriguez, bring them home." The words carried more weight than official orders or tactical directives. They represented the fundamental promise that military personnel made to each other, that no soldier would be abandoned, that every life had value, that some risks were worth taking because the alternative was unacceptable. Maya stepped out into the afternoon sunlight and felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied the transition from planning to action. Somewhere in the Pakistani tribal territories, 11 American soldiers were counting down their final hours unless someone could find a way to change the tactical equation. The conventional military approach had failed catastrophically, proving that superior firepower and advanced technology weren't sufficient when cultural understanding was required. Now it was time to test whether 8 years of being dismissed as too soft for elite operations had actually prepared her for the most important mission of her career. Time to discover whether the empathy and cultural sensitivity her superiors had labeled as weaknesses might actually be the strengths needed to save lives when everything else had failed. Maya climbed into the vehicle Stevens had prepared for her field research and began the drive toward the Pakistani border. Behind her, Brennan and Stevens would maintain the fiction that she was conducting routine intelligence gathering until her absence could no longer be explained. Ahead of her lay territory controlled by people who had every reason to kill her. On sight and no apparent motivation to help American soldiers. But Maya had spent 3 years studying these tribes, learning their customs, understanding their motivations and their honor codes. She knew something her superiors had never learned, that sometimes the most effective way to demonstrate strength was to approach potential enemies with respect rather than threats, to acknowledge their legitimate concerns rather than dismissing them as obstacles to American objectives. The success or failure of everything she'd learned, everything she believed about military service and cultural understanding, would be determined in the next few hours. The Pakistani border materialized through Maya's windshield as a landscape that looked deceptively peaceful in the late afternoon light. Rolling hills dotted with sparse vegetation gave no indication of the complex territorial disputes that had made this region a graveyard for foreign military operations. Mayas parked her vehicle at the last checkpoint, controlled by Pakistani regulars, knowing that everything beyond this point would be governed by tribal law rather than national authority. The checkpoint commander, Captain Mahmoud, examined Maya's credentials with the weary expression of someone who'd seen too many Americans disappear into the tribal territories with more confidence than preparation. His English was precise, but carried the careful formality of someone conducting official business he preferred to avoid. Miss Rodriguez, your documentation indicates research purposes, but this region is not safe for unescorted foreigners. I must advise you to reconsider your plans. Maya had anticipated this conversation and prepared her response carefully. Captain, I understand the risks, but my research involves interviewing tribal elders about historical prisoner exchange procedures. The information I'm gathering could prevent future conflicts by helping American forces understand local customs. Mahmoud studied her face, clearly recognizing that her explanation didn't match the tactical equipment visible in her vehicle. But he also understood the delicate balance of maintaining plausible ignorance about activities that might serve Pakistani interests in reducing American military presence in the region. I cannot provide escort beyond this checkpoint, he said. Finally, if you proceed, you do so without official protection from Pakistani authorities. We will not be responsible for consequences that may result from your research activities. Maya nodded her understanding and drove past the final official barrier into territory, where her survival would depend entirely on her ability to navigate cultural protocols she'd studied, but never personally tested. The road deteriorated quickly, transitioning from paved highway to gravel track to little more than parallel tire ruts, cutting through terrain that had remained unchanged for centuries. Her first challenge came after 90 minutes of careful driving, when she encountered a roadblock manned by tribal militia wearing a mixture of traditional robes and modern tactical equipment. The fighters approached her vehicle with weapons ready, but not immediately threatening, following protocols that allowed for the possibility of legitimate passage while maintaining defensive preparedness. Maya stopped the vehicle and stepped out, slowly, keeping her hands visible and her posture respectful. She'd rehearsed this moment during the drive, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether her mission continued or ended with her death in the tribal territories. Assalamu alaikum, she said in Pashto, using the traditional greeting that acknowledged the religious and cultural framework governing tribal interactions. The militia leader, a weathered man whose bearing suggested military experience, responded with cautious courtesy, "Wa alaikum assalam. You are American military?" "I am," Maya replied, maintaining eye contact while demonstrating respect for his authority. "I seek passage to speak with tribal elders about matters concerning prisoners taken from both our peoples." The militia leader's expression shifted slightly, moving from defensive suspicion toward interested calculation. Maya's use of Pashto and her acknowledgement of tribal authority had established her as someone who understood local customs rather than an intruder demanding access through force. "You travel alone to speak of prisoners? This is unusual for American soldiers." "It is unusual because the matter requires trust rather than weapons," Maya said. "I come to learn from your elders' wisdom about resolving conflicts without additional bloodshed." The militia leader conferred quietly with his subordinates in rapid Pashto that Maya could partially follow. They were debating whether her approach represented genuine diplomatic outreach or elaborate deception designed to gather intelligence for future military operations. Their decision would determine whether she lived long enough to attempt prisoner negotiations. "You will follow our vehicle," the leader finally announced. "Elder Rashid will decide if your words have value." Maya's heart rate spiked as she realized she'd successfully navigated the first checkpoint. The militia escort led her deeper into tribal territory, Past compounds where armed men watched her passage with expressions that ranged from curiosity to hostility. She was now completely dependent on tribal protection, with no possibility of military extraction if negotiations failed. Elder Rashid's compound appeared after another hour of driving through increasingly remote terrain. The structures were traditional. Mud brick construction surrounded by defensive walls that had been reinforced with modern materials. Maya could see sentries positioned at strategic points, armed with weapons that suggested significant military sophistication despite the traditional setting. Rashid himself was a man in his 70s, whose physical presence commanded immediate respect from everyone in his vicinity. He wore traditional tribal robes but carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions for hundreds of people. His eyes held the sharp intelligence Maya had expected from someone who'd survived decades of conflict in one of the world's most dangerous regions. "You are the American woman who seeks to speak of prisoners," Rashid said in English that carried only slight accent. "This is brave or foolish, perhaps both." Maya bowed respectfully before responding. "Elder Rashid, I come seeking wisdom from someone whose knowledge of justice and honor has guided his people through difficult times." Rashid gestured for her to sit on cushions arranged in the traditional manner for formal discussions. Tea was brought by servants who moved with the quiet efficiency of people serving someone whose authority was absolute within his domain. "Speak of these prisoners you wish to discuss," Rashid said. Maya took a careful breath, knowing that her next words would determine whether 11 American soldiers lived or died. "Elder, American soldiers were captured during operations in your territory. Additional soldiers were captured while attempting rescue. All of these men have families who wait for their return." "As do the men your soldiers have killed," Rashid replied without emotion. "War creates widows and orphans on both sides." "Yes, Elder, this is why I come seeking wisdom about ending the cycle of capture and killing that benefits no one." Maya pulled out printed photographs of the captured soldiers, placing them respectfully on the low table between her and Rashid. These men were following orders from leaders who did not understand the proper way to request passage through your territory. Their actions showed disrespect, but they are young soldiers who know little of the world beyond their training. Rashid examined the photographs without comment, but Maya could see him processing not just the faces, but the implications of her approach. She was acknowledging tribal authority over the territory, accepting responsibility for American disrespect of local customs, and appealing to traditional concepts of mercy toward young warriors who'd acted from ignorance rather than malice. "What do you offer in exchange for these lives?" Rashid asked. Maya had prepared for this question, knowing that successful prisoner exchanges required meaningful compensation that addressed the underlying causes of conflict rather than simply trading money for lives. "I offer acknowledgement," she said. "Public recognition from American military leadership that operations in your territory require your permission. Promise that future American activities will include consultation with tribal authorities. And guarantee that rescued soldiers will leave your territory immediately without attempting retaliation." Rashid was quiet for several minutes, considering her proposal while Maya tried to control the anxiety that threatened to undermine her. Carefully maintained composure. Outside the compound, she could hear the normal sounds of community life continuing, reminding her that her personal crisis was just another day's business for people who'd been managing similar situations for generations. "Your offer has merit," Rashid finally said, "but words alone are insufficient. Trust must be demonstrated through actions that carry genuine risk." Maya felt her stomach tighten as she realized Rashid was about to test her commitment in ways she hadn't anticipated. The negotiation was entering a phase where her preparation would matter less than her willingness to stake everything on the success of her mission. "You will accompany my men to retrieve these prisoners personally," Rashid said, his words falling like stones into still water. If you truly believe in the honor of your soldiers and the justice of your cause, you will risk your own life to prove that commitment. Maya felt the blood drain from her face as she processed the implications of Rashid's proposal. He wasn't simply agreeing to release the prisoners in exchange for diplomatic concessions. He was demanding that she personally participate in their rescue as a demonstration of trust and commitment. The test was more dangerous than anything she'd anticipated, but refusing would mean the immediate end of negotiations and the certain death of 11 American soldiers. "Elder Rashid, I accept your terms," Maya said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her system. "When do we begin?" Rashid's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, moving from calculated assessment towards something that might have been approval. "You understand that this journey will take you into territory controlled by different tribal groups? Some of these groups do not share my willingness to negotiate with Americans. I understand the risks, Elder, but these soldiers trusted their leaders to bring them home safely. Someone must honor that trust, even if their leaders have failed them." Rashid stood and walked to a window overlooking the compound's central courtyard. Maya could see armed men moving with the purposeful efficiency of people preparing for dangerous operations, suggesting that her acceptance had triggered immediate action rather than extended planning sessions. "The prisoners are held in 3 different locations," Rashid explained. 6 American soldiers are held by the Mesid tribe in a compound 20 kilometers north of here. 3 more are held by the Wazir tribe in a fortified position near the Afghanistan border. 2 additional soldiers are held by a smaller clan that operates independently but maintains alliances with both larger groups. Maya quickly calculated the tactical challenges involved in retrieving prisoners from 3 different locations controlled by separate tribal entities. Even with Rashid's support, the mission would require navigating complex political relationships between groups that might have competing interests in maintaining or releasing their captives. "Elder, how do you propose we approach these different groups? Will your authority extend to all 3 locations?" "My authority extends only to securing safe passage and providing introductions to the appropriate leaders. Each group will require separate negotiations, and success with one does not guarantee success with others." Rashid turned back toward her. "This is why your presence is essential. You must personally convince each leader that releasing prisoners serves their interests better than keeping them." Maya nodded, understanding that she was about to undertake 3 separate diplomatic missions, each carrying the risk of capture or death, each requiring her to adapt her approach to different tribal dynamics and leadership personalities. Complexity made success seem almost impossible, but the alternative was accepting the deaths of soldiers who depended on her to exhaust every possible option. "There is something else you must understand," Rashid continued. "News of the failed American rescue operation has spread throughout the tribal territories. Many leaders see this as proof that American military power can be defeated through proper tactics and local knowledge. Your soldiers have become symbols of American vulnerability." Maya felt her heart sink as she realized the broader implications of the insertion team's failure. The captured soldiers weren't just prisoners. They were trophies representing successful resistance to American military operations. Convincing tribal leaders to give up such valuable prizes would require more than diplomatic skill. It would require fundamentally changing their perception of what those prisoners represented. "Elder, how do I convince leaders to release prisoners who have become symbols of their success against American forces?" "By offering them something more valuable than symbols," Rashid replied. "You must help them understand that releasing prisoners demonstrates strength rather than weakness, that mercy toward defeated enemies proves superiority more convincingly than keeping trophies." A younger man entered the room and spoke quietly to Rashid in rapid Pashto. Maya caught enough of the conversation to understand that preparations for their departure were complete and that vehicles were ready for immediate departure. The urgency suggested that Rashid understood the time constraints involved in keeping the trapped insertion team alive. "We leave now," Rashid announced. "The journey to the first location will take 2 hours, and we must complete all negotiations before the morning prayer. After that, the tactical situation may change in ways that make prisoner release impossible." Maya gathered her equipment and followed Rashid through the compound toward vehicles that had been prepared for the mission. She noticed that the escort included both tribal fighters and what appeared to be former military personnel, suggesting that Rashid took the mission's dangers seriously, enough to assign his most capable people. As they traveled through increasingly remote terrain, Rashid explained the cultural protocols Maya would need to follow during each negotiation. The Mesud leadership responded to demonstrations of personal courage and direct communication. The Wazir elders valued formal diplomatic procedures and elaborate shows of respect. The independent clan operated according to purely practical considerations and would release prisoners only if convinced that doing so served their immediate interests. "Each group requires a different approach," Rashid emphasized. "If you misjudge their priorities or violate their protocols, the negotiations will fail regardless of what you offer them." The first compound materialized out of the darkness as a collection of low buildings surrounded by defensive positions that reminded Maya of the forward operating bases she'd served in during her deployments. The similarity was unsettling, suggesting that tribal fighters had learned tactical lessons from their conflicts with American forces and adapted their defensive strategies accordingly. Mesud tribal leader Yusuf Khan received them in a room lined with weapons that represented decades of successful military operations against various foreign forces. Khan himself was a man in his 50s whose scarred hands and calculating eyes suggested extensive combat experience. He listened to Maya's proposal with the attention of someone evaluating tactical information rather than diplomatic overtures. "You offer words and promises," Khan said after Maya completed her presentation. "But American words have proven worthless in the past. Why should these words carry more value?" Maya had anticipated this challenge and prepared her response carefully. "Because I stake my own life on their value. If American leadership fails to honor these commitments, you will know where to find me." Khan's expression shifted as he realized Maya was offering herself as a personal guarantee for American diplomatic promises. The proposal transformed abstract negotiations into concrete personal responsibility, creating accountability that extended beyond official channels. "You would return to face consequences if your leaders proved dishonest." "I would," Maya replied without hesitation. "Honor requires personal responsibility for commitments made in one's name." Khan was quiet for several minutes, studying Maya's face as if trying to determine whether her commitment was genuine or elaborate deception. Finally, he stood and gestured toward the door. "Come, we will retrieve your soldiers." The 6 captured rangers were brought from a holding area in conditions that suggested they'd been treated according to the Geneva Conventions rather than subjected to torture or abuse. They were exhausted, dehydrated, and clearly surprised to see Maya, but all appeared capable of walking without assistance. "Ma'am, are you here officially?" asked Staff Sergeant Williams, the senior captured soldier. "I'm here to bring you home," Maya replied, avoiding the question of official authorization. "Can everyone move under their own power?" "Yes, ma'am." "Are we expecting extraction support?" Maya met Williams' eyes directly. "I'm your extraction support. We have 2 more stops to make before we're all going home." As they prepared to leave Khan's compound with the first group of prisoners, Maya realized that the most dangerous part of her mission was just beginning. She'd successfully negotiated the release of 6 soldiers, but 5 more remained in custody, at locations where her approach might not prove effective. Each subsequent negotiation would be more difficult than the last, and failure at any point would likely result in the death of everyone involved in the rescue operation. But for the first time since arriving at the tribal territories, Maya felt the surge of confidence that came with proven success. Her approach had worked once. Her understanding of tribal honor codes had convinced Khan to release prisoners his fighters had risked their lives to capture. The impossible was proving possible. One negotiation at a time, Khan approached as they prepared to depart. "American woman, you have demonstrated courage tonight. If your leaders prove honorable, perhaps future conflicts can be avoided through wisdom rather than warfare." Maya bowed respectfully. "Elder Khan, wisdom shared between honorable people benefits everyone. Thank you for demonstrating that strength. Includes mercy." As their convoy moved toward the second location, Maya allowed herself a moment of hope. 6 American soldiers were free, but 5 more waited in locations where different leaders would require different approaches. The night was far from over, and success wasn't guaranteed. But she'd proven that impossible missions sometimes became possible when approached with the right combination of courage, cultural understanding, and personal commitment. The most important test still lay ahead. The second compound belonged to the Wazir tribe, and Maya could immediately sense the different atmosphere as their convoy approached the fortified position. Where Khan's fighters had projected the confident aggression of successful warriors, the Wazir guards displayed the careful formality of people who valued protocol above individual initiative. Their weapons were immaculately maintained, their positions precisely organized, and their response to the approaching vehicles followed procedures that suggested extensive military discipline. Elder Hakim Wazir received Maya's party in a reception room that reflected the tribe's emphasis on traditional authority structures. Elaborate carpets covered the floors, ornate weapons decorated the walls, and the seating arrangement carefully positioned each participant according to their status within the formal hierarchy. Wazir himself was a man approaching 80 whose physical frailty was offset by intellectual sharpness that had clearly kept him in power through decades of regional conflict. "American woman, Elder Rashid speaks of your courage in seeking the release of captured soldiers," Wazir said in English that carried the precision of someone who'd learned the language through formal education rather than casual contact. "But courage alone is insufficient for resolving complex matters that involve the honor of ancient peoples." Maya recognized immediately that Wazir would require a more elaborate diplomatic approach than Khan had demanded. Where Khan had responded to direct appeals based on personal honor, Wazir would expect formal presentations that acknowledged the historical significance of tribal authority and the complex political considerations involved in prisoner releases. "Elder Wazir, I come seeking wisdom from a leader whose knowledge of justice has guided his people through generations of challenge." Maya began, using the formal address structure she'd studied during her preparation. "The soldiers held by your people are young men who followed orders without understanding the proper protocols for requesting passage through territories governed by ancient law." Wazir nodded approvingly at Maya's recognition of traditional authority structures, but his expression remained calculating. "You acknowledge that your soldiers violated our territorial sovereignty. This is progress compared to previous American approaches. But acknowledgement alone does not address the consequences of such violations." Maya had anticipated this response and prepared a more comprehensive proposal that addressed the underlying political issues, rather than simply requesting prisoner releases. "Elder Wazir, I propose formal agreements that would establish consultation procedures for future American operations in this region. Your tribal council would review proposed activities and provide guidance that prevents violations of territorial sovereignty. You offer us advisory roles in American military planning." Wazir's eyebrows rose slightly, suggesting genuine surprise at the scope of Maya's proposal. "I offer recognition of your legitimate authority over territory your people have governed. For centuries, American military leaders have made the mistake of assuming that technological superiority eliminates the need for cultural understanding. This assumption has created unnecessary conflicts that serve no one's interests. Wazir leaned back in his chair, clearly processing the implications of Maya's offer. Formal consultation agreements would provide his tribe with significant influence over American military operations, while establishing precedents that could enhance tribal authority throughout the region. Such agreements would require ratification by your military leadership. How do you guarantee that promises made by a single officer will be honored by your superiors? Maya had dreaded this question because it forced her to acknowledge the limitations of her authority while maintaining credibility in negotiations, where any sign of weakness could prove fatal. Elder Wazir, I cannot guarantee that all American leaders will demonstrate the wisdom necessary to honor such agreements. But I can guarantee that some will, and those leaders will need local partners who understand both American and tribal perspectives. You position yourself as a bridge between our peoples. I position myself as someone who has learned that lasting solutions require understanding rather than dominance. The prisoners you hold are symptoms of a larger problem: the American military's failure to recognize that local knowledge is more valuable than foreign technology. Wazir was quiet for several minutes, his aged fingers tracing patterns on the arm of his chair while he considered Maya's proposal. Around the room, other tribal elders watched the negotiation with expressions that suggested they were evaluating not just Maya's words but her character and the sincerity of her commitment to the principles she advocated. American woman, your words suggest understanding that is rare among your people, Wazir finally said. But understanding must be proven through actions that demonstrate genuine respect for the consequences of cultural ignorance. Maya felt her stomach tighten as she realized Wazir was about to test her commitment in ways that might exceed her preparation or capabilities. Each tribal leader seemed determined to extract proof that her diplomatic approach represented genuine transformation rather than tactical deception. What proof do you require, Elder? You will personally deliver our formal response to your military leadership. You will advocate for tribal consultation agreements, even if doing so conflicts with your career advancement. And you will return to this region within 1 year to participate in the establishment of permanent liaison procedures. The commitment Wazir demanded was staggering in its implications. Maya would be required to stake her military career on advocating for policies that her superiors would likely consider dangerously precedent-setting. She would need to return to tribal territories that remained extraordinarily dangerous for American personnel. And she would be personally responsible for implementing diplomatic innovations that could either revolutionize civil-military relations or destroy her professional credibility. Elder Wazir, I accept your terms, Maya said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was promising. Wazir studied her face for several seconds before nodding slowly. Then we will release the soldiers held by our people. The 3 captured rangers brought from the Wazir holding facility were in slightly better condition than the previous group, suggesting that different tribal policies governed prisoner treatment. They were alert, relatively well-fed, and showed signs of having been allowed regular exercise and medical attention. Ma'am, Staff Sergeant Chun reporting, said the senior prisoner. Are we expecting helicopter extraction? We're walking out, Maya replied. 2 more soldiers to collect, then we're all going home together. As they prepared to leave Wazir's compound, Maya realized that the most challenging negotiation still lay ahead. The independent clan holding the final 2 prisoners operated according to purely practical considerations rather than traditional honor codes or formal diplomatic protocols. Their leader would likely demand concrete benefits that served immediate clan interests rather than abstract commitments about future cooperation. Elder, Rashid approached as the convoy prepared to depart for the final location. The last group will be the most difficult, he warned. Clan leader Jamil Khan operates more like a businessman than a traditional tribal elder. He will want to know what immediate advantages prisoner release provides for his people. Maya nodded, already formulating approaches that might appeal to practical rather than ideological motivations. What kind of advantages would influence his decision? Economic opportunities, security guarantees, access to resources or markets that benefit his clan directly. Jamil thinks in terms of profit and loss rather than honor and tradition. The final compound appeared after another hour of driving through terrain that had become increasingly remote and difficult. The defensive positions were less elaborate than those at previous locations, but Maya could see that they were positioned with the tactical precision of people who'd survived through practical effectiveness rather than traditional authority. Jamil Khan received them in a simple room that reflected his preference for function over ceremony. He was a man in his 40s whose bearing suggested military background and whose questions focused immediately on practical considerations rather than diplomatic niceties. American soldier, Elder Rashid says you offer benefits in exchange for prisoners. What benefits? Maya had prepared for this direct approach, but Khan's bluntness still caught her off guard. Clan leader Khan, I offer economic opportunities through legitimate business relationships with American contractors operating in the region. What kind of opportunities? Transportation services, local security consulting, cultural liaison work. Activities that provide regular income while utilizing your people's existing skills and knowledge. Khan's expression sharpened with interest. You guarantee such contracts? I guarantee introductions to decision-makers who need the services your people can provide. Success depends on your clan's performance, but the opportunities will be real. Khan was quiet for only a few moments before standing. Show me these prisoners are worth such promises. The final 2 rangers were brought from their holding area in conditions that suggested they'd been treated as valuable assets rather than defeated enemies. Both appeared healthy and alert, ready to move immediately upon release. Within 30 minutes, Maya found herself standing in the Pakistani darkness with 11 rescued American soldiers, all of them alive and capable of walking to safety. The impossible mission had succeeded through a combination of cultural understanding, personal courage, and willingness to stake everything on principles her superiors had dismissed as incompatible with military effectiveness. As their convoy began the journey back toward the Pakistani border, Maya realized that her real challenges were just beginning. She'd saved 11 lives, but she'd also committed herself to advocating for fundamental changes in American military policy that would either revolutionize how the United States conducted operations in tribal regions or end her career in disgrace. But as she looked at the faces of soldiers who'd expected to die in enemy territory, Maya knew that some risks were worth taking regardless of personal consequences. 6 months later, Maya stood before a joint session of Congress wearing the Medal of Honor that President Martinez had personally pinned to her uniform. The same tribal negotiation protocols that her superiors had dismissed as too soft were now being implemented across every special operations command worldwide. Colonel Harrison, who had originally demoted her to intelligence analysis, now served as her deputy in the newly created Cultural Liaison Division. The insertion team that had been trapped in Pakistani territory sat in the gallery, alive because someone had been willing to risk everything when conventional methods failed. The 11 soldiers rescued that night represent more than a successful mission, Maya testified. They represent what becomes possible when we choose understanding over assumptions, when we value cultural knowledge as highly as tactical superiority. Elder Rashid had traveled to Washington for the ceremony, becoming the first tribal leader to address Congress about military cooperation. The consultation agreements Maya had negotiated were preventing conflicts across 3 different regions, proving that diplomacy could achieve what force alone never could. Maya's proudest moment came when a young female lieutenant approached. After the ceremony, "Ma'am, I've been studying your negotiation techniques. When they said women couldn't handle special operations, You proved that some operations can only be handled by people who understand that strength sometimes looks different than expected. Maya smiled, remembering her father's words about preparing for moments you hope never come. The most important battles aren't always fought with weapons, Lieutenant. Sometimes they're won by people who refuse to accept that impossible means impossible. If this story inspired you, hit that subscribe button and join our community of everyday heroes. What impossible challenge have you overcome by thinking differently? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might inspire our next video. Remember, sometimes the greatest strength is knowing when not to fight.